Okay folks, this is the landscape tutorial. So I've gone ahead and opened up the tutorial file we've been working on for a while. If you don't have this, it's okay. Just open up a template, first person template, and you'll be able to do all the same work here. Okay, so the first step of what I do is the upper left select mode I change to landscape. It should default you to the Manage tab, but if it doesn't default you to the Manage tab, please select the Manage tab. We're going to leave all the defaults, although I am going to change the Z back to 0, which actually didn't change stuff very much. It looks like, actually it's really hard to tell, but it looks like we're going to figure out where that is actually going to collide with our existing level. Most likely it's going to be at the bottom, but it might slice through the middle. But we'll figure that out when we get to it. 63 quads by 2 by 2 sections, and then 2 by 2 components. And then I'm going to say create. This size will affect how big of a landscape you're making. And I'm just suggesting 63 by 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 to give us a nice size that should work on the lab computers. But you can make something bigger or smaller depending upon your own needs. Okay, that has gone ahead and created a pretty nice transition to our office unit here. There we go, looking pretty good. So what I can now do is I can use the Sculpt tool. And the Sculpt tool, I'm going to make sure that the strength of the tool is 0.3. I'm going to turn down the size of the brush. It's rather large. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and leave the brush fall off the same at 0.5. You can then start clicking in order to create raises in the landscape. And if you sort of go back over the same spots a few times, it will start making that rather large, much higher. The circle is my brush, and the smaller circle is my brush. The larger circle is the fall off, so it's having a lesser effect on those areas. And if at any point you want to push something back down, just hold Shift and then start clicking, and it will invert the move. You can even push things down below where you started from. There we go. Okay, so this brush is pretty good for smaller size movements. If I'm trying to do something larger, I could go back up to that 2048, and I could start creating some larger hills, maybe in the background, maybe on the periphery. So I'm trying to create a few things, some closer, smaller moves, and then some farther away, super high points. And at any point, I can go ahead and press play. And I can see what that's looking like. Hit escape to cancel out of that. And being really careful, I don't want to undo all this stuff that I've done close by, because this brush is really, really large. So it's also possible to use a brush that has a different fall off. I can go out to the outside edge here. And if I'm doing something like this, I'm getting a different type of contouring versus something like this, where I'm getting an even different type of contouring, versus something like this, which is going to be more like creating a plateau, similar to creating a plateau. But there'll be another tool for creating plateaus in a little bit. Just hitting Control Z to undo all those works. So that is the Sculpt tool. Pretty good, pretty useful. There is a clay brush setting. I don't use this very much. I haven't been in the habit of experimenting with the clay brush type. Definitely has a little bit of a different feel. Feels more like you're pulling bunches of clay, as you can kind of see. I'm sort of grabbing an area and sort of manipulating it. Definitely has a different massing, that clay brush. So feel free to experiment on that on your own a little bit. And when you're ready, I'll move on to this next tool, which is smoothing. I'm gonna set my brush back down to 250. And I can do a little bit of smoothing here, evening things out, making them not quite as rough, perhaps. I can do the same thing a little bit over here. My brush is a little too small to have much effect up here, so I might change that back up. Something a little larger. You can see I'm smoothing these things out, making it a little bit more like rolling hills. And so that's our smoothing tool. The next one is flatten. And flatten is really good if you're unable to get something like I have here, where there's a nice match between the outside and the inside, right? It's really coming up to that bottom part of my base. But say, for instance, I had created this level and it looked something like this, and I really wanted to get it down to the right height. Well, if I take the flatten tool, I can grab another spot that's at the right height, and then wherever I click will get pushed down and will match that spot. Grab a little bit more, and it will both push up and push down. Now, this will also work if you want to flatten something out and make a little plateau or a little landing. If I grab this one and start pushing that out, it will both raise and lower. I don't really like what it's done on that edge, so I'm going to hit undo. Maybe I make some softer, gentler clicks rather than flattening an entire area. So that's the flatten tool. Very, very useful. It's really good for making paths or walkways. And sometimes, actually, if I had done what I did over here with that flatten tool and made it sort of rough, I can also come back and I can do a little smoothing. And between those tools, I can get some nice looking landscapes. Okay. Next one is a ramp. And so let's say if I wanted to create a straight pathway, or maybe a driveway, or let's do something a little more subtle to begin. So to create a ramp, I click in one spot and I click in another spot, and it will try and interpolate between those two for the width that I set and with an amount of fall off. I personally like a little bit more fall off. And so the overall ramp width includes that fall off. So as I'm making that fall off bigger, it's making the actual ramp a little smaller. I can say, when I think I have that ready, I can say add ramp. And once I've added ramp, if I click away, the ramp tool will disappear and I won't be able to get those specific settings back. It's something you apply as a brush, and it's not something you can change in the future without redoing the entire tool. Okay, so that is ramp. We can also do some pretty severe ramps. So I can say, all right, from here to here, I want to do a ramp, but I want that ramp to come up to, so you can walk on the roof of the building. This is going to be pretty insane. It might actually come a little bit inside the building, so I might have to pull that out. Let's see what happens. Add ramp. And I'm going to click off of that tool. And there we go. If I was to go a little bit further, I might not be getting this nice clean edge. So it might be better for me to actually build something off the building to extend out to that landscape. That's pretty intense and pretty ridiculous. I'm going to undo that because I just wanted to show what was possible. Now the next tool I want to talk about is the erosion tool, and this tries to mimic the process of the slow process of rainfall, which slowly washes away soil. So in class, I don't remember what the settings were, but here I'm going to say 0.35 for tool strength. I'm going to set 80 for the threshold, which is a pretty big change. 256, 252, let's take it down a little bit. Let's turn up the iterations a little bit, and we're going to do both raising and lowering. And the noise scale, we're going to turn it down to something really small. Let's give it a little bit higher size, and let's do a more subtle fall off, or a bigger fall off, which will be more subtle. And then what I can do is I can move this over, and depending upon the geometry that I'm moving it on, it will calculate what the erosion would look like for that surface. So sometimes it's smoothing some things out, sometimes it's creating gullies, other times it's just creating a little bit of unevenness. But I typically feel like this makes things rougher, and very often it makes things look a little more mountain-like and less hill-like, which makes sense considering what erosion does. Now I'm being a little sloppy on this, and you can sort of see what's happening there. Might be better for me to actually mimic the way in which the rain would sort of come down and fall, and that's going to give me those ridges that are a little bit more of an understanding of how the water would really run down this. Right, this ramp would probably get some water running down the sides. There we go. Okay, so that is the erosion tool. The hydro tool is a little bit similar, and I'm not as familiar with it, but it simulates erosion caused by rainfall. So I'm going to skip over that one, and I'm going to go to noise. Noise is just going to create a little bit of variation in moving things up and down so that, you know, in some areas we have some things that are perfectly flat, and adding a little bit of noise here, that seems a little bit too big. Let's turn that down. Adding a little bit of noise is just going to create a little bit of variation, make things seem like they're a little bit more natural, and it's going to move things both up and down. If you're finding that you've made things a little too rough, you can always go back and grab your smoothing tool and clean that up with the smoothing tool. Now, I'm going to talk about mirror, which is something that I mostly use for bigger things like you can create balance between two sides of a map using mirror. You can, if you're creating a valley and you want to have a similar mass on one side from the other, you can do this. But what this does is it creates a giant plane, and then there's an arrow, and it's taking everything from one side of that plane and copying it to the other side, and the arrow is showing you the direction it's copying it. So if I just go ahead and say apply, you can see I have a very drastic change where these elements have been copied over to here and overwritten that condition. The other thing that happens is I end up with this, and let me turn up the camera speed. If you're finding you're moving too slow, now that we're working on a bigger scale, you can move the camera, you can change the camera speed to be something higher so you move faster. So you see this ridge? This ridge is really something that's coming because it's on the mirror plane. And so one of the things that you can do when you're doing this is you can, and I'm going to undo, is you can add a smoothing width. So you could add something pretty considerable, and it's going to, when I apply, it's then going to try and blend the two sides so that I end up with something a little bit smoother. So here we go. That is now a mirrored landscape. And after I've done that, it's an action that's been done. It's not something that will keep mirroring. So typically I want to do all my work and then mirror, and then I can do more work. So if you want to have two things that are similar, two sides that are similar to each other, but not exactly a copy, you can do the mirror, and then you can come back and make some additional fine tuning, some additional manipulation. I'm going to go ahead and just undo that mirror tool because I like the variation that I have. And then next I'm going to talk about the select tool. So the select tool has a brush size as well. Let's do 750. It also has a fall off, and I like to use a smaller fall off with this. You can paint an area, and when you paint that area, it becomes essentially protected, so that if I start trying to sculpt things and I sort of run into my protected area, the fall off will be affected, but that's all that will be affected. I can't move the stuff that I currently have selected with the select tool. I'm gonna undo that again. And looking at the select tool, there's use region as mask. So if you're using the region as a mask, it's essentially preventing anything from affecting it. And you can reverse your mask so that what you're affecting is, you can reverse your mask, and then if you switch to another tool, then you'll only be affecting things within that region and that fall off. I won't be affecting all of the other things around it. Let's undo that because that was just to show how we can make these changes. Let's go back to negative mask, and this would be another place where, like, if I wanted to apply noise and I wanted to apply noise outside of this like perfectly manicured area that's pretty flat, I could also do the same thing. So select works with a lot of other tools. One of the tools it doesn't work with is the ramp tool. So if I select ramp and then try and create two things and go ahead and say add ramp, it completely ignores the selection. And when I go back to the select tool or go back to one of these other tools, it remembers the selection again. I can clear region selection if I want to stop using that. Okay, so that is all of the tools for how we craft our terrain, the geometry of the terrain. Next up, we're going to talk about materiality, adding grass and rocks. And I think I'm going to stop this tutorial here, and I'll make that a completely separate video for your watch. Thanks a lot.